Hello, thanks for tuning in. It's Joe Simhart here again. It's February 18th, 2025. And I think this is around my 100th video, a short video that I posted on cults and the occult. So I thought I'd do a quick summary of what the hell I'm trying to do here. So a lot of this has to do with my experience with cults and helping people emerge from them and lectures about them and all of that since the early 1980s. So what am I getting at? I mean, what's the purpose of all this? I'm not trying to solve the cult problem. I'm not trying to get legal means to evaluate and dismiss new religions. I don't really care. I can't care about all that. It's way too big, way above my head. My concern is just communicating with one person at a time or a small group that wants this kind of information. And if they don't, well, go somewhere else. But in summary, what are my concerns? So if we go back to Plato, the entire human experiment in making cities, clans, tribes, and religions is based on what he called a pious fraud. So what does he mean? Well, his basis for that is that everything, philosophy, science, for human beings is based in some mystery that only myth or metaphor can begin to address in terms of what's the truth behind our existence, all right? So I'm putting it kind of simply. So in a sense, let me get this little card off of here. We have this young girl in church, and you can see she's asking, what if it's all bullshit? Well, it kind of all is, but bullshit can be useful. You know, we can fertilize with it. We can examine it to see if the bull is healthy. It's something which is part of life. It's what we release as a result of digestion. It's recyclable material. And it's also toxic, you know, if it's used wrongly. And that's what we're getting at here, is the bullshit toxic. And how do you find out? How do you know if it's toxic? So I've looked at theosophy quite a bit since I minored it in college in the late 60s and theology. And three of the things that philosophers tend to look at or examine are problems of knowledge. How do we know things? How do we grasp something? Epistemology, teleology, metaphysics. Problems of conduct. What is our social psychology? You know, how do we behave? What makes an ethical life? What makes behavior meaningful? And on the opposite side of that, how do we disrupt meaningful behavior? How do we constrain it and not allow it to thrive? So problems of conduct. The third thing that philosophers tend to look at is problems of governance. Invariably, new religious movements, or what we call cults or sects or whatever, startup gangs, tend to collapse when it comes to conduct and governance. The leader could be really narcissistic and his conduct is questionable because everything's about the selfishness. And then new religions tend to be very inept in how to govern. The more autocratic leaders don't like to share power, so there's no balance of power, and there's a top-down kind of instruction or command as to how to get to heaven, or you know, how to interpret a scripture, or how to produce spiritual experiences, you know, and all of that's governed by the guru, the person at the top of the pyramid. So most new religions, most startup cults, like most startup business, tend to collapse because they don't know how to self-govern, and because of the conduct at the core of the whole thing just isn't mature enough or healthy enough or ethical enough or any of that. So what philosophers then tend to look at is, beyond the tricks of language, how do we interpret things, is how do we communicate this sort of thing, and how do we behave when we communicate, and how do we produce something practically from philosophy into life that helps. Our founding fathers in America with the American experiment went through all these questions. A lot of the Scottish Enlightenment folks inspired Jefferson and Adams and Hamilton and Franklin. There was a pragmatic approach to the Enlightenment from the Scottish Enlightenment that was applied here. That's a tough lesson to sort out, to apply, to learn, but the balance of power, the ability to get rid of a bad leader, the separation of powers, the ability for everyone in a movement or whatever to have a voice of some kind, a means, even though they don't control it all, and a way to avoid autocratic behavior, which tends to devolve into an abuse of power very often because we're human, right? So the other part that I want to look at is, there's lots of models about cults, and the one I've been using all along basically is one, there's some kind of a transcendent attraction. It could be going to heaven. It could be self-improvement. It could be, how do we make a better city? It could be some weird mythology like Russian cosmism, which I talked about in another video, which gives a basis for national religion. So it's some transcendent attraction, and then there has to be someone that interprets that, and that becomes the guru, the leader, the management group, or whatever, which then hands it down to the people that in their naivete and ignorance, and they want to learn something, they begin to agree or disagree with what's being handed down. The people that agree become devotees or of like mind or gang members or whatever, and they go into a kind of a psychological orbit. The central idea becomes the theme, like German nationalism, for instance, in the 1930s, became a big theme. And everyone begins to orbit around that idea. And then that orbiting now becomes a circle of influence within, and it begins to exclude information that doesn't agree with the circle of influence within. And we have an us and them thing. And then the fourth aspect of all of this, where things tend to go bad, is what's called exit perils or exit costs. What does it cost me? What's going to happen if I reject this and leave? In some cases, you die. For instance, fundamentalist Islam, if you leave the sect or the cult and become an infidel, you can be marked for death. Mafia businesses, if you were in the inside and you left, you better hide and change your name, because now you're treasonous and you could become a snitch to the government or whatever, and they have to get rid of you. So where I'm going here. The other form of exit pearl is that, well, if you don't stay with us, you don't have a chance for your ascension, and you might not go to heaven, and you are now on the side of the devil, and God damn you, and it's just words basically at that point, and accusations, and also reputation. They can ruin your reputation by saying things that you did in the group, like, he used to balance our books and keep double books, and we caught him, and that's why we kicked him out, whatever. There's or the person was lying to us about whatever, and you can't trust them. So your reputation is going to be assaulted, like mine was to some extent when I talked out against the group I left, and has been hundreds of times or more, because I have a bad habit of criticizing hundreds, maybe 1,000 groups. So where does all of this come down in terms of our personal psychology? What happens to us when we collapse into these orbits of influence? I've been using R Bion's work on groups, and I did a video, I think, on it. But basically, he was saying that when he had a group of neurotic soldiers he was observing in therapy, he would allow them to just work on a project. And what he noticed over the years was that the most narcissistic or the most psychopathic of the members of this group of recovering neurotic soldiers after World War II, that personality disorder would take over as leader eventually. And it was an interesting thing. And what he felt was going on was three kinds of basic assumption states that people would collapse into. So when you have a kind of a nervous, anxious population, like we do in some nations, for instance, after World War I, we had that kind of population in Italy. And people like Mussolini, who's an ultimate narcissist and quite pathological, became a great orator. He sounded great. He promised a lot of things. People saw him as a rising hero, and that he was going to solve the problems of the state. People were even thinking that he could create miracles like a saint, practically, because a lot of the population was Catholic. They were already believing in that kind of a thing. And so you see they fell into a basic assumption state. And that's difficult to get out of, because if you get information that is contrary or that corrects that state of mind, people will rebel. They'll reject the person trying to create them and maybe even kill them. But in any case, they go through cognitive dissonance. They might look at the evidence and then think, wow, I can't be that wrong. There must be something wrong with the information. And they do a real easy switch in their brain, which goes back to the original belief system and rationalizes it. And this is very common in human affairs. So this is what we see when you try to give someone information, say about QAnon, and they're totally into it. Years ago and even today, they think about it for a minute, and then they go back even harder into the belief system after talking to more people and rejecting the information you gave them. So all I'm saying is very difficult, to intervene and to help someone change their mind. And I'm saying that very carefully because the person has to change their own mind. You cannot change their mind. You cannot take them out of a cult. A person has to choose out. And so the interaction of the interventionist with the person is educational. And then you have to leave it up to the person to make a choice. And you have to respect their choice in the end, whether you like it or not. So that's a summary of what I try to do here. I hope it helps. And I hope you all have a good day. Thank you for listening again.